Thanks very much. I'm really honoured to be here. I'm going to give a 40-minute sermon on the subject of does political violence work? And as some of you will have noticed, this is close in title to one of my pathetically selling books called Does Terrorism Work? But I'm going to talk about more than just terrorism today, because I want to reflect on some of the relationships between different kinds of political violence. So in order to give you a sense of where we're going through the sermon, there are going to be 5 points to what I say, or 5 sections of it. And the first 4 points are going to be why I think the question about efficacy is important. The second point is going to say, why is it a difficult question to answer? This is particularly thinking about terrorism and whether it works. The third section of the talk will be about how I think we should go about answering it in a serious-minded way. The fourth point will be, at the risk of meaning that none of you do buy my book, and it'll be what I think the answer is to the question. And then fifthly, I want to reflect on other kinds of political violence more directly, particularly some thoughts about war and about the extent to which political violence in war works or not. So I'm going to talk mainly about terrorism in the first 4 points and then about war in the last one. But I would want to stress at the start that in using the term terrorism, I'm not suggesting that it's really the right word. It's one of those words like radicalisation that is the wrong word, but we're kind of stuck with it. And I used to write about political violence without using the word terrorism at all. I wrote a book on the IRA some years ago and basically didn't use the word terrorism because it seems to me that the word terrorism carries with it such a negative connotation that if I say that Peter is a terrorist, the assumption is I'm saying he's a bad guy. In other words, there's a value-laden quality to it, and I thought it was better to avoid it. But now I've changed my mind on that, because the point is the word isn't going to go away. And if you leave discussion of non-state political violence to people who are happy with the word terrorism, you're kind of leaving it to Fox News and to Sebastian Gorka and others, and I don't think that's what I want to do. So I'm going to discuss the definition in a bit, but the first 4 issues of the talk will be about terrorism, and the 5th will be more specifically about war. But in all of this, I hope what I'm saying has some relevance to different kinds of political violence: state, non-state, local, national, international, and how they relate to each other. So first part of the sermon, why does the question, does terrorism work or does political violence work? Why is it an important question? I think 2 real reasons why it's important. This, imagine, first of all, is about thinking about major issues. So let's assume this is a major issue. I think it's important for 2 reasons. The first is that if you're looking at why people carry out political violence, they tend to do so because they think that it's the only way or the best way of achieving something which is essential or precious. So when you look at what people who've been involved in non-state terrorism say about why they've done it, they tend to say things along the lines of one famous, now deceased member of ETA that, quote, the only possibility we have of gaining our liberty is through violence. The only possibility we have of gaining our liberty is through violence. And again, if you look at warfare and why people justify the awfulness involved in state-sanctioned war, or if you look at non-state violence by terrorist groups, it's the idea that this is the only way of bringing about something precious, something necessary, something essential. So in other words, if we're explaining why people do political violence, a crucial aspect to it is that they think it's going to work. And it seems to me that's an essential basis for understanding. It's not actually all that common in the media that that's there as the reason why people do it. You far more commonly find if a bomb goes off or somebody's run over in the street or whatever it is, that there is something nearer to a pathologizing, that these are crazies, that these are people who are gangsters, rather than looking at it as something which is seen as a practical way of bringing about something essential. But my point here is that I think the question about whether terrorism works, more broadly also whether political violence works, involves more than just saying people do it because they think it does. Let's ask whether they're right or not. Okay? We can't claim to understand political violence analytically unless we know the extent to which, the ways in which it does or does not work. And I think for all of us as citizens, that's something which is a crucial aspect of understanding. But I think it also has a practical aspect to it. If, for example, at the end of our session today, we decided that terrorism overwhelmingly doesn't work, or indeed decided that state violence in warfare doesn't work, this would have profound practical implications for us as voters, for us as people who, if we're involved in politics or in government or in the media or in the police or in the army or in universities or whatever it is, in civil society, because that would have implications for how we make some of the most important choices in our lives. Okay? And I think if it is the case that we understand, let's say for example, if it turned out that non-state political violence works much more effectively in some contexts rather than others, or that some ways of responding to it make it less likely to happen rather than more likely to happen, that would be of political importance in a really significant way. So I think the question is important regarding terrorism, even more so regarding the much more lethal kinds of violence involved in state actors getting involved in warfare, to ask the question analytically. We can't understand political violence unless we know whether it does actually work, or the ways in which it does, or the contexts in which it does. But we also will have some practical implications of that. And the ghosts of all of this are those shelves of books on one of the walls in my study, which are the memoirs of politicians. And you rarely find politicians saying that war that I justified was a really bad idea. You sometimes find it, but very rarely. And you rarely find after wars a unanimity from the people who've engaged in them saying this was just a huge mistake. And it seems to me that it is at least possible that, as part of our conversation, we might decide that political violence overwhelmingly does not achieve that which is supposedly justifying it. Let's remember what we're talking about. We're talking about the most awful things you can do to someone else. We're talking about murder, we're talking about maiming, we're talking about often very intimate brutality. We're normally talking about people being defenceless at the point at which they're injured or killed. That decision is one which, I'll come back to this at the end, has a huge moral implication, and we can't make those moral choices unless we understand whether political violence works, and we can't make those moral choices unless we know the practical implications of that. So I think it's an important question we're discussing. Okay, so why is it a difficult question? Or is it a difficult question? I think it is a difficult question to answer. I spent years writing the book, Does Terrorism Work? And I realised why no one had bothered to write one before, because it's a really difficult question. Partly in terms of terrorism, because it's very difficult to know how to define that word in a way that's meaningful. Okay? Because obviously, because the word is very negative with its associations, people generally want to use it against those they disagree with. And defining what terrorism is, defining what political violence is a very awkward foundation for dealing with the question we're dealing with today. So for example, is terrorism something which, as some people claim, is terrorism only something that non-state actors do? Or do states do it as well? Is terrorism only something which is violence directed against civilians or non-combatants, or is it something which can also involve attacks on the military? When I was working on the book, Does Terrorism Work?, quite early on in conversations with people, when I talked about writing this book, people would refer to the 1980s Beirut truck bombings, because they're one of the instances where terrorism seemed to work, because after those murderous attacks, the US and others did leave the Lebanon seemingly in reaction to it. Of course, most of the people killed in those attacks were military. So by many definitions of terrorism, this wasn't actually an act of terrorism at all, it was something else. So the definition really does matter. If terrorism is something only done by non-state groups, you're talking about one kind of violence. But if, like me, you think that most deliberately terrorising, politically motivated violence through history has been done by states, then you're talking about something much different, a much bigger scale of violence. So it seems to me the one difficulty we have with this question, does political violence work, but particularly does terrorism work, is what do we mean by that? So for example, if you have implied political violence by a state which is anticipating a riot and has heavily armed police on the street, even if they don't use the violence, they're threatening it, is that political violence? What is it we're defining? And I think you have to be very precise about that. What I mean by terrorism is politically motivated violence of various different kinds, but in the book, Does Terrorism Work?, I'm mainly focusing on non-state groups, not because I don't think states do it, because I think it's very difficult to write about the state and the non-state actor in the same book. But I think the crucial point here, and if there's one thing I hope you will take away from this talk, above all the other points that I make, it's that the relationship between non-state actors and states is what really changes history, rather than non-state violence itself. Okay, so even if you look at this century and the last century, both of which began with acts of famous terrorism, the assassination in 1914, which was the trigger for the First World War, the 9/11 atrocity in September 2001, which started this century off. In both of those cases, the merciless violence involved in those acts wasn't what changed history. What changed history was the state responses to it. Catastrophically in the case of the First World War, I think pretty catastrophically in the case of the responses to 9/11, and I think we haven't yet seen the full outworking of the legacy of the responses to 9/11, which I think will get more egregiously bad in future years. But the key thing is it's a relationship between different actors which defines it. Okay? So I think if we're looking at the definition, it's really important to ask the question who it is we're talking about, what kinds of violence. And when I talk at the end of the talk about war, I'm going to be broadening it out to think about what states specifically do. But in all of our discussion of terrorism, I think we need to think about the ways in which the relationship between state and non-state actor is crucial. So if you're looking at why people justify violence from non-state perspectives, Bin Laden, quote, "Why are we fighting and attacking you? Because you attacked us." Okay, first, they can continue to attack us. Sheikh Yassin, one of the Hamas leaders, "We have the right to retaliate if they kill our civilians and target them." Again and again, the idea that you've done something wrong against me and I can react to it is why non-state actors engage in violence. But similarly, if you look at state violence, very frequently it's because of the non-state provocation. Why did the war on terror, which involved massive state violence, rightly or wrongly, why did that occur? Because of the atrocity of those murderous attacks on the day that Bin Laden called Holy Tuesday in 2001. So it's about the relationships which fuel it, but I think you have to be precise about what you define. The second thing why it's difficult is it's difficult to know what working means. So commonly when you have asking the question, does terrorism work or does political violence work, people come up with a straightforward answer. Yes, it does. Look at Martin McGuinness, people will frequently say. Or, no, it doesn't. We haven't got X, Y, or Z that we were fighting for. It seems to me those answers are probably deceptively simple in that in many areas, I would argue in most areas of human endeavour which matter to us, the answer of whether something works or not is a complicated one, not a straightforward one. That one simple answer isn't going to adequately work with it. So you find in the literature on the subject of terrorist efficacy, you get books and articles written with titles like Why Terrorism Works or Why Terrorism Does Not Work, but they normally mean different things. So for example, the political scientist Max Abrams, based in the States, has written an article called Why Terrorism Does Not Work, by which he means it doesn't tend to achieve its major policy objectives. The controversial Harvard lawyer Alan Dershowitz has written a book called Why Terrorism Works, by which he means it gets things like publicity or interim concessions. Now, they might both be right because they mean something different. So when we're asking does political violence work, even more so, but certainly when we're asking does terrorism work, we need to know what working would actually mean. I think if you think of any area of your life which matters to you, the idea that it's simply answerable by no, it didn't work or yes, it did, probably refers to something trivial rather than to something substantial. I'm tempted, I was hoping I might get through an hour and a half without mentioning Brexit, but it's not possible, is it? So in future years, there'll be exam questions which say, did Brexit work? And people will automatically have instinctive answers to that, but it seems to me it's unlikely to be a question adequately answered by yes or no. It might not happen, which would mean you didn't have the exam question, but assuming it happens in some form, there'll be a complex set of answers. And when you look at work on strategy in general, whether it's strategy, military strategy, business strategy, sporting strategy, violence strategy, you normally find that there's no simple outcome, did it work or not, but you have to define therefore what it means. I think a third reason it's a difficult question is proving causation in human endeavour is incredibly difficult. Okay, even if today we set up the Black Box Liberation Front, carried out some violence to declare freedom from the city of Belfast, and they said, oh, we can let that bunch have their freedom, proving that it was this that made the difference is very difficult. So in this city, in Belfast, for example, to the extent that political violence over the last 50 years has changed things in Northern Ireland, in the north of Ireland, how do you know it's the violence that made the difference, rather than the non-violent arguments pointing in the same direction by people who eschewed violence? How do you know that it's the violence that made the difference, rather than the partly autonomous changes in economics, in social mobility, in demography, in political context? Proving human causation is very difficult, except in very straightforward things. You know, he picked up the watch, he dropped the watch, it fell, that sort of thing. But those things that you can easily prove causation in tend to be somewhat dull. Something about whether political violence works or terrorism works is more difficult. And the final reason I think it's a really difficult question to answer, particularly in relation to terrorism, is because it's so controversial. Because I knew that whatever answer I came up with in my book, people would hate me for it. Because if you say it does work, oh, there he's encouraging it. If you say it doesn't work, oh, he's condemning those who are involved in it. I was very proud of one of the reviews of my book, which described it as being morally repellent, which I took as a real compliment, because I've got accused of lots of things in the past, but generally being morally repellent is not something that has come in. So I like to add new abuse when I can get it. But what this guy meant was that I seem to be treating terrorists as if you need to discuss them calmly rather than with moral outrage, which I thought was kind of part of the point of being a professor, because anyone can go down the boozer and say, I think it's horrible when someone gets blown up. It seemed to me important to look at it dispassionately. If you go to a doctor, You don't want the doctor to condemn cancer. You want, thump the table and say it's a many-headed hydra of evil that must be got rid of. You want them to give you some kind of diagnosis, explanation, and possibly even remedy. And I think the same is true here. Because I recognise that in this city of all cities, it's a very sharp-edged question, because everybody in this city has some connection to some of the loss that it's experienced in our lifetimes. But it seems to me the fact that it's a controversial question means it's probably a more important one to answer, rather than we should shy away from it. So, first part of the sermon, I think it's a really important question. I think it relates to all sorts of things that are happening as we switch on our phones and look at the news around the world. I think unless we can think about this question calmly, we're going to continue getting the world wrong. Those of you who know me know I'm instinctively a pessimist about our species. I think that we need daily redemption for our lack of capacity to improve things. It's a grim prediction to make. I think this century is going to be even worse than the last one, which is quite an achievement. If you think of what happened in the last 100 years, this is going to be worse, okay? I also think in the future, if there's anyone left in 200 years, they'll look back and say, were these people really discussing Brexit while they were destroying the planet through climate change? Did they really want to talk about the backstop while over 3 million children were dying of avoidable hunger and disease around the world? For goodness sake. But anyway, I think there are things where we're going to make this worse this century. We're going to make it much worse unless we think about political violence, what it actually achieves. And I want to talk about war at the end specifically, because I think that's the most dangerous. I think it's a difficult question, but I think that's the reason we should address it, even though it's one which makes it more complicated. And I think it's something which therefore involves us thinking, thirdly, how should we try and address the question, does terrorism work or does political violence work? And I'm going to suggest, first of all, that I think we need a framework for what working might mean. And I think there are 4 main layers to that. I think the main objective of those who engage in serious political violence is to bring about strategic victory. So the top layer of what working would mean would be that you wanted to achieve, in Hamas's case, the destruction of Israel and the establishment of an Islamic Palestinian state covering Mandate territory. You carried out your violence, it happened, you got your result. In the 1930s and 40s, you might have wanted to carry out violence in order to establish an independent Israeli state, which would give a space for Jewish people to have their identity protected. You carry out violence, and it happened. In other words, strategic victory will be you get a victory, you get what you want. Right? I think that's quite rare, as I'll say in a minute. The second level would be what I'd call partial strategic victory, which would be where you get a kind of decaffeinated version of this. So you might not get the destruction of Israel and the establishment of that Palestinian state, but you might get a 2-state outcome which gives you certain kinds of control in Gaza or the West Bank, and you think it might not have happened but for the violence. You might not get, and I'm not saying that's what I think will happen, but you might not get an independent Basque state covering all of the Basque provinces in France and Spain, but you might accelerate the likelihood of a greater respect for Basque culture within Spain. Again, I'm not saying that's what I think has happened, but that's an argument which I have heard put by some Basque separatists. You might not get a united Ireland, but you might claim that the acceleration of reform in the north is something which has been brought about through the pressure of violence. And again, that's not an argument I'm saying I agree with, but it's one which has been very forcibly made to me. You might have the argument that loyalist violence has made it less likely that a united Ireland would be conceded by the United Kingdom state, and that therefore that has been something which doesn't involve victory, because you would rather not have, if you're a loyalist, presumably you'd rather not have seen Martin McGuinness in any position of political power. You'd rather not have seen some of the changes that had been made in Northern Ireland, but you might claim you got a partial version of what you wanted. I think partial strategic success can also involve what you might call secondary goals. So you might not get rid of the state of Israel, but you might get revenge against Israelis. You might not destroy America, but you might damage it. And there's no doubt that some of the enthusiasm that very small minority of Muslims globally who supported Al-Qaeda's violence welcomed, some of the celebration of it was due to the damaging lashing out at America. Bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy was the way bin Laden put it, which didn't happen, but they did celebrate the fact that bin Laden's and his colleagues' work did damage America in terms of hitting it psychologically, hitting it economically. So you might get revenge and you might sustain resistance. Thirdly, I think in addition to political violence, working strategically or partially strategically, there's the tactical level. I think 9/11, for example, which was a hideous event morally, clearly, and I think which was strategically very unsuccessful. I don't think 9/11 meant that America was less involved in Muslim countries. I don't think that 9/11 meant that there was a renaissance of a certain kind of Salafism. I don't think 9/11 meant that apostate regimes in Muslim countries were removed. But tactically, there is no question that 9/11 was a huge success. Indeed, it went beyond that which they seemed to have anticipated. Small number of people, the people involved in making that happen, fewer than the people in this room. Okay. Very inexpensive. Unquestionably did help to change history, not I think in the strategic direction they wanted, but it did make a significant tactical impact. You might get operational successes in that sense. I think many groups that have engaged in non-state political violence that have been the ones we would tend to study, the FARC, PLO, Hamas, Irgun, the IRA, the UVF, so forth around the rest of the world, ISIS clearly, Al-Qaeda clearly, they're important because they have at least some kinds of tactical operational successes. They also frequently get publicity, and one of the many things that violence does secure for you, particularly if you're not powerful enough to have your own state, is publicity. So how many people around the world have heard of ETA in a way they've not heard of the PNV, the Constitutional Ba'ath Party that was vastly more popular for the most part during ETA's violence than ETA. I travel around the world a fair amount. The two people from this city of whom people have most commonly heard are George Best and Bobby Sands. And I think that it's clear that there are more people who've heard of the IRA than the SDLP, and if you said to people, can you name 20 people from either of those groups, people would be more easily able to get at least near to 20 IRA people than to 20 SDLP people, even though during the Troubles the SDLP overwhelmingly, repeatedly, again and again and again, had more supporters in the Northern nationalist community than the IRA. In other words, you do get publicity, you do get people noticing you. I think you also get tactical successes in the sense of undermining opponents. And here I think one of the things which, I'll come back to this in the third part of the talk, or the fourth part of the talk, when I try and talk about how I think this has worked in practice. You very frequently find that non-state actors will do things that provoke states into undermining themselves. So I think, for example, in the War on Terror, which I think had some successes, had some failures, one of the things that was undoubtedly a failure was the degradation of the ways in which Western liberal democracies felt they should treat people. The way in which in the United States of America there was a redefinition of what torture meant to try and make it more and more difficult for something to be described as torture. Okay, and that undermined, in the public view, in my view rightly, to the extent that it happened, it undermined what those states stood for, because it seemed to remove the Weberian distinction between states as legitimate wielders of force and non-state terrorists as illegitimate wielders of force by doing things which are manifestly out of tune with the way you think you should treat people normally as a liberal democracy. So you can get tactical successes, operational, publicity, interim concessions. You take someone hostage, you get money. You take someone hostage, you get your prisoners released. You can get publicity. You can gain control over populations through violence, and you can gain a strengthening of your organisation through gathering money. So there are non-trivial tactical things. And the fourth level, in addition to strategic success, partial strategic success, tactical successes, I think there are also what you might call inherent rewards. And I'm not saying people do violence primarily because it psychologically feels good, or they're excited, or they like the comradeship, or they like the buzz, or they like the money, or they like the friendships, or whatever. But those things are non-trivial. Certainly when you look at memoirs of people who've been involved in non-state violent groups, exhilaration, the sense of being part of something righteous, the shift from deference to defiance, the shift from triviality to something more significant are important aspects which can be sustaining of groups. I think when we look at these fourfold things, strategic, partial strategic, tactical, inherent rewards, I think they also apply to different kinds of political violence. Okay, I think, for example, if you're looking at the way states engage in warfare, you can get a strategic victory, you get an outcome which is exactly what you want, or you can get a partial strategic victory, which is like a compromise, but it's nearer to what you wanted than you think you would have got without violence. Or you can get some secondary goals, where you can redefine a particular region, or you can redefine a particular actor. You can certainly have tactical successes in terms of some of the violence you've carried out and its particular effect, and there are unquestionably some inherent rewards. Huge inherent costs, of course, as well, because people involved in violence suffer terribly through what happens to them, but inherent rewards for it as well. So if we're thinking about how states respond to terrorism, for example, there's a lot more going on in counter-terrorism than just countering terrorism. So for example, if you're involved in, during the last 20 years, if you were involved in the economics of producing drones, the war on terror will have gone better for you than for most people. There's a non-trivial economics to this, as there is to warfare. Okay, in other words, there are ways in which all sorts of inherent rewards can come out of things. Some people have a good war, and I'm not being facetious. It's me recognising that there are different inherent rewards in this for all sides. So, we're getting through the sermon. It's an important question, if you believe me. It's a difficult question. You have to believe me on that because I spent years with my beard going grey writing a book about it. I think it's a question which involves a framework, which means that you look at this not saying yes or no, but thinking of all the different ways it might be yes or no. And we'll come to some examples in a minute of particular groups. But if you think about the history of this city, history of this society, if you think about what's happened in Colombia, if you think about Israel-Palestine, if you think about global jihadism, if you think about Boko Haram, I don't think there are easy questions. And clearly by the time you get to the First World War, the Second World War, the American Civil War, the Lebanese Civil War, you're into territory which is far from being yes or no, if you're going to have a serious discussion of it. And I think you do need some sense of what the different kinds of working would be. So fourthly, what's the answer? I should stop now and say just go and buy my book on Amazon, but I'm not going to. I'm going to do you a favour and save you the money, despite its attractively priced quality. Yeah. So I think the answer is that political violence, certainly in the case of terrorism, though I think in other kinds of violence it's eerily the same, turns out to be just like most things that humans do. You rarely get what you most want. Okay, so strategic success is very rare amongst terrorist groups. You could make a case, not popular to make in some circles, that Jewish violence in the 1930s and 1940s significantly accelerated the establishment of an independent Jewish state. I think even that's complicated, but you can make that case. You could make the case that the FLN in Algeria had very great significance through violence, much of which was clearly terroristic. But it's very unusual for a non-state actor to end its campaign getting what it wants. So I've gone through, there are some cases I know very, very well, there are some cases I know less well, but I've looked at in enough detail to get an answer on this. Very, very rare that you get what you want. Okay. I also think that's probably true. I'll say something about this at the end. It's even more uncomfortable to acknowledge this, but I think that's probably true of most warfare as well, which has much greater levels of violence. But if strategic victory is unlikely, a sort of decaffeinated, slightly diluted version of it is much more common. Let's talk about what's happened in this city. You could make the case that there was an acceleration of the urgency of reform in the north through it being higher on the agenda. And people have claimed that there was a sense of that having represented an acceleration of nationalist redress agreement. You could make the claim that one of the reasons that there has been a shift in terms of Israeli popular and political opinion in terms of attitudes towards certainly Gaza and to some extent the West Bank is because of the persistence of Palestinian violence, making it a pressing issue which will not go away. And you certainly get secondary goals. Revenge is the one. Again, this is the pressing thing to comment on. One thing terrorist groups and certainly one thing warfare brings about very repeatedly, very successfully is the secondary goal of revenge. I might not get the destruction of America that I wanted. Interestingly, bin Laden, I think I never met him. I know people who did, and I never met him myself. I kind of wish I had. I suspect he's rather intriguing fellow for all of the iniquitous things that he did and supported. Bin Laden's grasp of international politics is pretty ropey. Okay, quote, "We believe that America is weaker than Soviet Russia." Good luck with that one. Okay, but it does seem to me that there is a sense that while not destroying America, there was a jolt to American self-confidence and to the American economy, which was non-trivial through that atrocity. And I do think that it has had an effect which involved getting revenge on Americans, which is good enough for some of them. If you look at some of the literature from Hamas warriors, again, you wander around with these quotations in your head when you write these books, but there's one very blunt Hamas statement, quote, "I hate Jews and at any opportunity I have I will kill Jews," says this particular Hamas member. In other words, whether or not you destroy Israel, having a go at Jews might be something which gives you some satisfaction. That's much more common. So the strategic victory, the top level is very rare. More likely you'll get the second, more still you'll get the third. In other words, you might not get strategic or even partial strategic victory, but you will have a good chance of some tactical successes. What will those look like? If you're one of the organisations or one of the conflicts we're actually interested in, because it's become important enough to discuss, you'll have got some stuff right. And that is true of, clearly ETA have fizzled out now, but they did manage to pull off some extraordinary acts tactically in terms of operations. The IRA has for the most part ceased to exist in a meaningful sense, but it did carry out some acts of sustained violence against a moderately sized and major state over a generation. Some of those tactical operational acts were very successful. Likewise the FARC, even the Baader-Meinhof group are much less major organisation than those I've just mentioned, did manage to carry out some things which were not only eye-catching, but somewhat daringly effective at a tactical level. And gaining publicity is probably the thing at tactical level which is most common. The media don't always deal with this in ways which help, because I think there is a tendency to exaggerate the significance and to some extent the bogus glamour of those who are involved in it. So with the Boston Marathon bombing some years ago, there was a rather good article which some of you will have read in the Rolling Stone, and the article was actually very calm and measured, but the cover picture of the brother made him look kind of cool. And I think there's a tendency perhaps to play up the degree to which you get publicity. So after the Manchester atrocity in England, for about 2 weeks, the English media only talked about Manchester. So there was a sense if you were, for example, a somewhat disenchanted former low-level criminal who'd had a drugs past, was a bit marginal, then had a conversion to a certain kind of redemptive Islam and wanted an ISIS-friendly apotheosis, you would seem to be confident you get 2 weeks of publicity out of it. In other words, you can get some publicity through this violence. There's an argument for saying much less about it than we do, actually. There's an argument for saying much less about terrorism. Why? Because it's actually very, very unlikely to hurt you. The chances statistically in any given year at the moment of an American in America being killed by terrorism are around 1 in 4 million. Chances of an American anywhere in the world getting on a plane which has a terrorist bomb on it are about 1 in 22 million. Very, very long odds. Okay? In other words, there's a huge sense of its importance as opposed probably to its actual threat. But that does mean you get publicity in a disproportionate way. The Harvard psychologist Steve Pinker comments on terrorism having what he called a cockeyed ratio of fear to harm. And it's a bit like shark at the beach. I used to think with our kids, if you said to them, don't go swimming in the water, you'll drown, they'd say, shut up, Dad. If you said shark, they'd come out of the water really quickly. And terrorism is a bit like shouting shark. Okay? So in the academics John Muller and Mark Stewart have calculated in the decade after 9/11, leaving aside what America already spent on homeland security and leaving aside the costs of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, in the wake of 9/11 over that decade, there was a $1 trillion increase in homeland security spending. Most of it on things like air marshals that never capture a terrorist. They sometimes break up a fight between people, but they don't. Okay. So there's a huge amount of spending. Now, you could spend that things on things which are much more likely to kill you. There are things in the United States that are much more likely to kill you than terrorism. Clearly, gun violence in general, far, 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 far more likely. Car accidents involving deer, more likely to kill you than terrorism. Accidents in the home where something falls off your wall and hits you on the head. Deaths by drowning in the bath. My favourite is that you're more likely by far in America to be killed through autoerotic asphyxiation than through terrorism. And yet, I think the war on autoerotic asphyxiation is unlikely, though having said that, who knows the way politics are going at the moment. It might be that that's what the Democrats come up with to try and get rid of President Trump, is that you have a war on this, but I think even that's unlikely. My point is that publicity is something you do secure, and similarly I think when you get to the last level, inherent rewards, you find it's a very mixed bag, as it is in life. Does football work for footballers? Yes, if you end up with a very successful career. No, if you don't. Does boxing work for boxers? Yes, if you're fighting in Vegas for millions. No, if you're fighting in Wolverhampton Leisure Centre for 50 quid. Okay? Does academic life work? Yes and no. There are inherent rewards and inherent costs. So in other words, terrorism, but I think this is true of political violence more generally, turns out to be incredibly normal. And whereas most people think that when you say people who carry out political violence are normal, just like everyone else, they find it slightly depressing because it seems more comforting to think there's this other species of people who are kind of crazy or out there, different. Actually, the truth is we know this isn't the case. Okay, it's normal, and it turns out it's just like most things you do. You rarely got what you really, 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 really want and what justifies it ultimately. Get a more decaffeinated version of that and pretend that's what you wanted all along and maybe get some secondary goals. Certainly some tactical successes, but you'd never probably have started it just for the tactical. And if you're lucky, you'll get a good war. If you're unlucky, you get a bad war. And what we tend to find is that as in so many kinds of human endeavour, we post hoc rationalise in ways that change what we really wanted, so that we make it seem more justifiable to have done what we've done, because we claim we got more of that than we thought than in fact we did. Or we said that what we said we really wanted wasn't what we really wanted, we're just using that as a bargaining chip, and what we really wanted was the thing we actually got. So it turns out that terrorism is much like business. Fifthly, and then I'll end, let's talk about political violence more generally, and particularly a few reflections on war. None of them popular when I make them normally, but maybe they will be today. Let's see. First of all, there's a depressing disjunction between the reasons that states say they go to war and the historically emergent reasons for the thinking which actually took them to war. In other words, the multi-causality behind going to war rarely is a coextensive circle with why you said you did it. And why you said you did it is almost always much more noble and lovely than the reasons you actually did it, which are much more messy and morally jagged. There's an equally depressing disjunction between the reasons that people fight in war and either of those, either the ostensible reasons or the state reasons. And people fighting in war is often to do with things which are quite banal in terms of politics. Bunch of mates joining up together, you're bored, you need the money, an inspiring cousin said you should join up or do it. So why did we go to war and why we actually went to war are only partly overlapping circles. And why people actually fight and keep fighting in them is only a partly overlapping circle with either or both of those. Worse still, what we say afterwards about why we did it and how it turned out and what we achieved is only partially related to any of those either. So people don't want to remember that the reason they joined up wasn't anything to do with the cause, it was because of X, Y and Z that had nothing to do with it. And they certainly don't want to remember that there was a disjunction between what they were supposed to be fighting for and what they're actually doing it for, nor do they want to acknowledge that actually what happened was much more messy. So if we're having this conversation in Warsaw, even the war, which is the just war, you know, if you want a just war, you always invoke Hitler after a while. Before long you get to Hitler and say, well, you know, that was the case where pacifists have a really difficult job because, you know, what sort of world would you have had if everyone had responded pacifically to that monstrous man? And of course, if you're sitting in Warsaw, you say, well, actually, yeah, of course, we're delighted that the Nazis got beaten, but look how it ended for us. You know? And if you look at the relationships of people to even that egregious regime, the Nazi regime, as research again and again across countries, including every country that I've looked at, people's actual reactions at the time turn out to be much less conveniently morally hostile to the Nazis than they seem later on when everyone claims they were in the resistance. Okay? In other words, I think there is a way in which we misrelate why we do it to why we claim we do it, and why people actually fight in it and how we remember it, which is a long-winded way of saying that war turns out to be much less justifiable in most cases you look closely at in terms of achievement of otherwise unachievable things than we'd like to remember. Okay, which is one of the reasons why I think this morally really matters. And I think you see this in our lifetimes in recent discussions. So I remember very clearly the justifications around the very complex issue of the US and its allies going to war in Iraq in 2003. And I don't think it was a simple thing. I think there were reasons which are quite sustainable for thinking that it was worth considering. I wasn't in favour of the war myself. I certainly think in terms of fighting terrorism, it was a disastrously ineffective thing, but there were other reasons for going to war. But if you listen to the rhetoric, we now know, and anyone who's bothered to read through the Iraq War inquiry knows very, very clearly, there was an awful lot of prestidigitation and fancy footwork in terms of justifying things at the time. And more and more of that will become common. And how it's ended up, which is still, of course, unfolding. Again, not a straightforward thing. I think there were good things achieved and some disastrous consequences which are burning as we speak. But it does seem to me that the why is it claimed you're doing it, why are you actually doing it, why are people actually fighting in it, and what do we remember about it are circles which need to be much more aligned if this is going to be a justifiable human awfulness than they tend frequently to be. And I think that's even the case with the war against the Nazi regime. The two other points I'd make on war, and then I'll finish. One is that I think far more that happens in war needs to be recognised as being terroristic than is fashionable to say. I do think it's difficult to write books about non-state terrorism and state terrorism in the same pages because the dynamics of states are so large and different to non-state groups, but I don't think one is necessarily more important than the other, and I think that much that happens in war actually fits many definitions, even those states' definitions of terrorism. The deliberate targeting for political purpose of non-combatants or civilians very often happens in war, including wars by liberal democratic states. And I think if we recognise that, we'd be less glib about the distinction between terrorism and state violence, which I think is a more ambiguous and porous line. But we'd also force ourselves, which is my final point, to thinking morally about how often we should sanction using appalling violence. And I'm maybe just getting older and older and slightly more soft as I get older, that there are fewer and fewer conflicts as I get older that seem to me close to being justified by what was supposed to justify them when you set the human suffering as against the achievement. I mean, the book I wrote on terrorism ends up arguing that the long history of terrorism and counter-terrorism suggests that you're far more certain to cause appalling human suffering through terrorism than you are to achieve benign change politically or socially. I mean, just the empirical evidence is, I think, unarguable on that. But you could also make the claim that the same is true of many state endeavours in terms of violence. You're far more certain to cause appalling human suffering than you are to achieve benign change. Now, it might still be the right thing to do. I'm not a pacifist, though I would be a useless combatant. I would be that sort of professor at the front who just would be useless in a fight if I got there and would try and find reasons not to get there. So I'd be the sort of person you'd want to stick in jail for the duration of the conflict. But even if I was any good at it, I think there are things where, for the most part, I wouldn't be wanting to engage in it because I don't think it works. So my point about this is I think the question about efficacy is important. It's difficult. We need a framework. We need to think about it historically rather than just in the moment. I think broadly it turns out that it doesn't work at the top level. More diluted or secondary things are more common, tactical much more common, and the inherent rewards cut in different ways for the actors. But that pattern, which is again and again common, it's there in the PLO, it's there in Hamas, it's there in ETA, it's there in the IRA, it's there in the UVF, it's there in the FARC, it's there for many of the groups throughout history which really, really matter in terms of political violence by non-state actors, I think is also possibly more appropriate to state violence than we'd like to think when we think about the conflicts which have done much to shape the world.